Yeah, international research. This is an issue which impinges on me because, as an anthropologist, despite the fact that I'm employed in sociology, clearly doing research outside the UK is sort of comes with the territory, really. And the question about whether or not there are any specific issues which attach to doing that kind of research is quite an interesting one. And I promised Europe 2 years ago that I would write them a policy note on this. And I think they've finally managed to trap me by getting me to do a public talk, so I've more or less written it. So I think the only reason I'm here today is actually to make sure that I contribute the policy note before I retire in September. You don't have to point it this way, you can point it that way, it works perfectly well.
Your magic touch, Richard.
My magic touch. So, but the first question that we have to ask ourselves really is what actually is international research? And there are at least 3 distinct kinds of non-medical research involving human participants and personal data which you can consider to be international. Now, so I'm exempting medical research from this, and I'm exempting research that doesn't involve human participants and personal data, because if we included them in the discussion would get too broad and too deep for 40 minutes. Well, the first kind of research is research which is wholly based within the UK, but which uses already existing data which has been gathered elsewhere outside of the UK. And this is a very common pattern, particularly in large data set comparative research. The research is wholly based in the UK, but you use data that's already existing outside the country. You draw on that data. The second kind of research that can legitimately be called international is where you have collaborative comparative research with colleagues who are outside the UK, where there is data collection going on as part of a coordinated project of which one is a part, but it's in different countries. And that's the kind of international research with which many of us in this audience will be familiar. And the final kind, and this is actually where I get into my own specific territory, is where a UK-based researcher leaves the UK to do research outside the UK of whatever kind. So I'm going to look at each of those in turn, and then at the end I'm going to ask whether there are any really quite specific issues in general attaching to research done outside the jurisdiction in which one is based. Now, for the sake of argument, I'm just going to talk about the UK, but it would apply if you were based anywhere and doing research outside your own jurisdiction. And I'm also, for the sake of argument, just going to talk about Sheffield, doing research from this university, and I hope people won't find that too parochial, particularly given the nature of the topic. And I will attempt to leave some time at the end for questions. So, research based in the United Kingdom, but using research data that has already been, secondary data that has been collected but comes from elsewhere. And here, I think, you might think, well, there aren't too many ethical issues attached to that because the data already exists, but if we're going to use it here, for example in Sheffield, we do have to satisfy ourselves that it is, so to speak, acceptable data to use. We have to be certain that the data were gathered in a way that met any in-country legal and ethical requirements, actually in the place where it was originally collected. We have to be certain that it's kosher, if you like, from that point of view. We also have to be certain that the university's research ethics policy, the kind of requirements that we make as a consequence of that policy, that those have been met in the collection of the data. And if relevant, I think we have to satisfy ourselves that we are satisfying appropriate professional ethical requirements. And I want to talk a little bit about that one now, because it is really, I mean, you might wonder why it's so important that we satisfy ourselves that the hands of those who collected the data originally are sufficiently clean that we can use the data. And there's a fairly straightforward answer, which is that it's increasingly becoming difficult to publish unless you can actually say to the journal or whomsoever that you are satisfied that the data satisfies the required ethical standards. So you've got to actually be able to satisfy yourself about this. So the professional standards are important as well. They're not as binding on us as our own institutional policies or the legal requirements, but if we want to publish, and if we want to publish internationally, increasingly, for example, in America, you've got to effectively sign a form for lots of journals. So you need to think about that. But how does one do this? The challenge, in fact, may be how we satisfy ourselves that the data is satisfactory. And this is a matter of detailed documentation. There needs to be a paper trail, and it needs to be a good paper trail. We need to know what the local, in-country, legal and research ethical requirements are. We don't just take them for granted, we need to find out specifically what they are. And in the process of doing so, by the way, you might actually find yourself rather surprised. I do lots of work in Denmark, where there are next to no ethical frameworks governing non-medical research with human participants. Now, you might think this is Scandinavia, where they over-regulate everything. But in fact, in Denmark, no. I mean, I sit on research council panels, and I've become rather a nuisance to them, actually, because I always mention ethical stuff. And at first, 5 or 6 years ago, when I started doing this, I would get blank stares from my sociological and anthropological colleagues, because this is not something that I ever considered. Norway, however, is a completely different kettle of fish. In Norway, there's some wonderful ethical frameworks that you've got, or hoops that you've got to jump through, shall we say. So you have to actually find out what's going on and not take anything for granted. You should neither take for granted that there is or there isn't ethical requirements. But you need to know what they are. And then you need to know more about the sources of the data. You cannot simply trust people. You cannot simply, rather, you will probably not know who collected this data. You will probably not know them. And you can't simply treat it, take it on trust that because it's available, that it's acceptable. Oh, well, you can do that if you want to. It's perfectly possible to do that. But my strong advice would be that you don't do it, because actually it can come back and bite you on the bum. And that is not something that you want to happen. So you need proper translation. You need to make sure that the bits of paper that you get, if they're not in English, you need to have them translated. This is already, as you can see, beginning to add to the irritation, the amount of work involved, and probably the cost. But you need to do it. Now, are there any exemptions to this? Well, yes, there are, interestingly. Depending on, if you look at the University of Sheffield, we acquired a research ethics policy, as you've already heard, in 2004. Technically, and probably sensibly, anything data from before 2004 is not covered by that, probably not covered by those requirements. You still need to satisfy yourself that local ethical requirements, if they existed at the time, were satisfied. But before, data coming from before 2004, well, you might also say, it's not actually on here, you might also say, well, if it's publicly available, it's okay to use. This is a very tricky argument. It's a very tricky argument indeed. I can see the force of it, I can see why if something's in the public domain, it's fair game. But I still think, well, it's the public domain or not, that you need to be very careful about deciding if that simply makes it exempt. And this is where we come to common sense, caution and judgment. Even with historical data that dates from the pre-ethical governance era, and there was a pre-ethical governance era, and it's approximately the year 2000 in Britain, approximately. And anything that dates before that pre-ethics governance era is in principle fair game. But do you actually really want to use medical data, for example, that's been gathered by experiments on prisoners for which no consent was obtained? The answer is you probably don't want to use data of that kind. So there's a whole set of issues here. And common sense, caution and judgment. Actually, common sense, caution and judgment are always required. I'm simply making the point that they're no less required when we come to dealing with international research. And which brings me to the second type of international research. This is where we're doing collaborative research with colleagues outside the UK. and where they collect their national data and we collect our national data. And the same ethical requirements exactly are present. But the fact is to make sure that in-country legal and ethical requirements are being satisfied. We've got to make sure that our Sheffield requirements are being satisfied, and incidentally also any legal requirements that we have, particularly with the legal institutions. And relevant, once again, the same professional ethical requirements for all of the same reasons. Now, collaboration. Collaboration is rather different to using data sets which you might be able to access because they're in the public domain, or data sets that you might be able to access because a research council has archived them or something. Collaboration should involve trust. If collaboration doesn't involve trust, probably you shouldn't be doing it. If you don't trust them, don't collaborate with them. And that's not just to do with ethical matters, it's to do with things in general. I don't know if anybody here has ever engaged in any international collaborative research. I know some people have, but you sometimes have to choose bedfellows with caution, and it can go wrong. So in the first place, if you don't trust them, don't collaborate. And then, as I've already said, you've got to be aware that not all jurisdictions or HE systems have these research ethical requirements that we are increasingly taking for granted, as we should do. And that can be quite complicated. If you were doing collaborative research with, say, colleagues in Denmark, this is actually, I've got scars of this. If you're doing collaborative research with colleagues from a place like Denmark, well, there isn't, in fact, any governance framework for research ethics, then you do really have a slight issue, because, okay, they're doing their bit, but it's a collaborative project on which you're a member, and it is a kind of distributed, shared responsibility for the thing to be done right. And I think this comes down to the third bullet point. The crucial matter is to ensure that no matter how irritating your collaborative partners find it, no matter how much of a pain in the bum, that's twice I've said bum actually, so I have to try not to say it again. No matter how much of a pain your collaborators may find it, you have a duty to yourself and to the university to insist that ethical considerations are built into the planning of collaborative international research right from the get-go, right from the very beginning. These are not something that you can come to later. This is not something that you can simply bolt on at the end. This has to be built into discussions and research planning right from the word go. Now, increasingly this will not be a problem because people are increasingly realising, even those who do not function within well-organised systems of ethics governance, such as those that are increasingly the norm in Britain. But things like proper procedures for obtaining consent, but that's a practical matter of research design. And it has to be built in right from the word go. It's not something you can bring late to the table and say, but. So if you're involved in this kind of collaborative research, you have a responsibility, it seems to me, to the university and indeed to yourself as a professional, to ensure that you don't rely on anybody else to do this. You have to make sure that everybody you're collaborating with knows that this is an issue, these are issues that have to be dealt with. And they have to be dealt with sooner rather than later. Most ethical issues are not difficult to deal with. You just have to deal with them. You just have to make sure that the right things are being done. But if the right things are not being done, then they do all of a sudden become difficult to deal with. They become issues that are not easily resolved. So my advice would be, and it's not just ethics, it's also data protection. This is another very thorny issue. I think Joe might have something to say about that later on. Data protection in collaborative international research. Would you prefer to say it's a bit of a minefield?
At the very least, yes.
At the very least. So all of these issues have got to be built in right at the beginning. You've got to make sure that people's eyes are on these balls right from the word go. It goes without saying that one's own element of international collaborative research has to go through all of the normal University of Sheffield ethical approvals. There are no exemptions. And this brings us to the third category, which is a little bit more complicated again. This is where one goes out as a researcher or as a research team and does research elsewhere in another jurisdiction. Once again, all these three things still continue to apply. You've got to make sure that you're satisfying the in-country legal and research ethical requirements. You've got to make sure you're satisfying the university policy requirements and professional ethical. These things are the kind of framework which all of us, all of the time, pay attention to. But what are the challenges here? Well, become responsible in a very, very pointed fashion for ensuring the I's are dotted, the T's are crossed, everything has been done. If one is either a solo researcher or leading a research team, there's a considerable amount of responsibility gets devolved onto one's shoulders. In a way, and I think it's come back. It might well be considered an extra burden of responsibility. We'll come back to that in a minute. One is also, after that, in other words, you've got to make sure all the permissions have been obtained, you've got to make sure that all of the legal obligations are being met, blah, 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 blah. This involves making sure that you find out what all the legal requirements are, what the in-country research requirements are, and so on, and so on, and so on. Ignorance is not a defense. So there is all of that work to be done. But then you become responsible for the day-to-day conduct of the research in the same way as that one is in Britain, by the way, the data collection, relationships, locals, and so on. And then you're responsible for your research subjects, to local communities and local officials, to the host institution, if you're attached to a host institution, and to everyone else for whom you're normally responsible. There's a whole set of responsibilities here. I've chosen to frame it in this way because my own personal experience is that actually there is a rather subtle qualitative difference between doing research at home and doing research abroad, and it has to do with the kind of responsibilities you assume in a day-to-day way. It's different. In other words, you're a guest. I'm not a guest in Jenkins. I'm not a guest in Devon. I'm not a guest. Not in the same way anymore. We're both guests here. And therefore one has the responsibility to be a good guest in all these respects. So it looks like there are layers of responsibility. On the one hand, there probably are, but we also have to ask ourselves another question. Are there really these extra layers of responsibility? Responsibility for obtaining proper ethics approval, both in Britain and if need be abroad. Well, we have that responsibility anyway. That is a responsibility we already have, except we may have it in two places here. Responsibility for legal compliance. Once again, this is a responsibility we already have, except we may have two different legal frameworks to do. And that can be quite interesting, by the way, when the law is not the same in two places. Responsibility for personal and institutional reputation. We always have that. That's not new, it's not the strangest argument. Responsibility for the management and conduct of research. I think we already have that. And our responsibility to research subjects. Well, we already have that too. So in fact, the responsibilities are of no different kind than the responsibilities that we have if we are doing research, so to speak, at the bottom of our garden. The situation may be more complex. In fact, I go so far as to say that the situation will be more complex. But the responsibilities with respect to research ethics are essentially the same. And those responsibilities are, to repeat myself, to one's research subjects, to one's hosts, to one's institution, professionally and personally to oneself. None of those responsibilities are any different. Just the manner in which we observe them in society might be a wee bit more complex depending on the nature of the local context. Okay. So this then leads me to ask, is this kind of research, doing research outside the UK, actually based outside the UK, does this pose any special ethical challenges? Well, like all good answers, it's yes and no. And I want to explore a little bit of the yeses and the nos. Yes. Yes, there are special responsibilities. Firstly, you have a responsibility to get to know the national law involved and other regulation. Now, since my experience is that most of my colleagues, and I include myself in most of my colleague category, are probably insufficiently informed about the law and the regulation of covering research within the UK, then it's absolutely the case that we need to be extra diligent in making ourselves as au fait as we can be with what the situation is outside the UK. And it's not just about, by the way, the letter of the law or the letter of regulation. It's about, if you like, the tenor of different legal systems, the background of individual rights, the way in which legal systems operate. Anybody who's had anything to do with legal systems on mainland Europe will know that they operate in rather a different way to Britain, in all kinds of ways. They are very different. This is a relic of the historical split between Roman law and Anglo-Saxon common law, and it is really quite different. So you need to know about this, at least as well as you can be informed. That's the first specific term. And then there's the everyday mutual understanding stuff. Language, interpersonal etiquette, local norms and rules, passive ways of doing things, and so on. And this is about, once again, being a good guest, in the first place, anyway. It's about not putting people's noses out of joint. It's about not being seen to be rude even if one doesn't mean it. So one has to invest some time and energy in doing this. And now, the language thing here is important. Now, if you do a research project of a short duration elsewhere, and there is some English speaking, it's probably a little bit unrealistic to expect you to acquire full fluency in language for a 2 or 3 month project. You might want to think about acquiring some knowledge of the language, at least, and so on and so on. Interpersonal etiquette. Anybody who's lived anywhere else knows that these things are very different. And interestingly, the fact that one shares language with people from elsewhere doesn't mean that the rest of us, not the interpersonal etiquette, the local norms and rules, etc., are just going to be the same. Everybody knows that England, so that Britain and the Americas are separated by a common language. I can't remember who said that, but some smart happened. But it's true. You go to the States, and the fact that you speak the same language can lead you into the most awful complacency in terms of how to behave. So, in a way, you've all got, anybody who works abroad has got to become a little bit of an anthropologist. Not, please, a huge bit of an anthropologist. There's enough Muslims, there's enough amateurs joining in. But you've all got to acquire some sort of anthropological sensibility. And the trouble is, learning this stuff takes time. And this does raise an issue about the use of translators as well. It raises a real issue about the use of translators in this kind of research. My own experience is that they may be indispensable, but they're unlikely to be unproblematic. So, just as long as you approach the whole situation with care and caution. And then there's the business of not just about understanding them, it's a business about understanding ourselves, how we present. Now, part of the problem here is that any sociologist in the audience will know urban governance work, and urban governance work tells us that this kind of stuff, presentation of self, presentation of myself, of gender, human beings with a certain status, perhaps with a certain sexual orientation, etc., etc. A lot of that goes on under our own personal radar screens. We do it without thinking. We do it fairly unreflexively. Well, if you do the kind of research that requires you to be elsewhere and interact with the locals, you need to start being at least a little bit reflexive about this and thinking about it. Thinking about your own presentation of self and how you might be coming across. Really, really important. Next, there are notions of privacy which vary enormously from place to place and culture to culture. You cannot take for granted that you understand what privacy means when you're outside your own comfort zone. You really cannot do that, or you shouldn't be doing that. And privacy is one of the principles which is at the heart of research ethics. People have a right to their privacy, and they have a right not to expect that it should be trampled on. So, one of the core things that you need to understand if you're working in a different cultural context is what the notions of privacy are. All of this stuff, taken means that you may have some difficulty occasionally in anticipating the consequences of your own actions or the actions of others. Your capacity to manage that ordinary everyday sense of predictability without which social life is a bit difficult comes under some pressure. Finally, there is obviously different institutional bureaucratic procedures and demands. What do you do, for example? I've just thought this as a question, I don't have an answer. What do you do if you've got all the clearances, everything, all the papers have been stamped, and you're heading out into the wild to meet whatever it is you're doing, and that local police chief makes it very clear that actually, if you want to continue to do your work, you're going to have to stop it. This is not a hypothetical example. It's never happened to me, but I do know those it has happened to. What do you do? I don't think there's a straight answer. Actually. One of the things you don't do in the first instance, I think, is reply at all. You need to retire to your text with some serious thought. And then one of the things about mobile phones actually is that you can go mobile. Actually, also making sure you've got a satellite mobile phone. But this is all difficult, and this is all about culture. All about culture and culture difference. Now, it's tricky. No one suggests it's easy. But the one thing that is actually easy because it's necessary, not everything that's necessary is actually easy, but this is actually quite easy. Just go into the field knowing about this stuff in advance. Go in the field knowing what to think about. Go in knowing that there are going to be issues. And having at least thought about what some of the responses you might make would be. So that's the yes side of it. Yes, there are special research ethical challenges posed by working outside the UK. But here's the no side. And the no side is really important. Because pretty much all the factors I've mentioned on the previous slide apply in the UK as well. We live in a multi-ethnic and otherwise culturally diverse society, and issues of these kinds may come up. I did some work in the southwest, in London implication in the southwest about 5 years ago, 6 years ago. I got lured into that. I started doing this work before 2004. Into a little episode of the evil eye of witchcraft in the southwest English market town. All of those things I just talked about in one way or another apply. All of them. And this was before we get to any massive major cultural differences. So we do live in a complex, diverse society. We don't live in a society which has a uniform monoculture. Thank goodness. So all the things I've just talked about in different ways apply here at home as much as they do elsewhere. And in fact, and this I think is, I've never thought about this, but there is a really interesting point to make. In fact, these issues are likely to be more obvious when working outside the UK, more in your face. Which means, in fact, that working at home, in inverted commas, may be ethically be more problematic than working away because the stuff you take for granted because you are at home, which you don't take for granted when you're not. So there are a number of facets to this particular discussion which I think are rather interesting. So, the ethical challenges of international research. Doing research involves human personal data anywhere involves ethical challenges, and those challenges are pretty much, I think, universal, or we have to treat them as if they were. So while we should be sensitive to local laws and conditions, we also need to maintain our own standards of behaviour. Going native is not a good idea. We have to stay who we are here. And finally, because doing research outside the UK is not easy to be governed by UK data protection law, because where is our data eventually going to be stored? It's going to be stored here. And there's nothing in UK data protection law that says that data, personal data, that relates to people who live outside the UK who are not UK citizens isn't covered. There's nothing that says that. So, we're covered by UK data protection law, and we're also covered by research methods. End of slideshow. And